Good evening and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Thursday the 16th of September and this is Scotland at 7. I'm Andrew Wilson and this evening I'm hosting the programme from Edinburgh. First, we will look at today's brief coronavirus update, then I will introduce this evening's guest, and then together we will discuss the stories behind today's news headlines. Now, daily data on new cases, tests and vaccinations has not been published today due to a technical issue affecting the availability of the data from Public Health Scotland. However, I can tell you that there are 26 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 8,319. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 1,054 were in hospital last night, 94 of whom were in intensive care. The latest UK daily figures show that 134,805 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, and that's an increase of 158 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just in hospitals. Now then, this evening we are lucky enough to be joined by one of our regular contributors, the activist, disability advisor, and one of the founders of Dundee Together, Siobhan Tolland. Earlier this year, Dundee Together won an Openreach Community Connectors Award for working to tackle isolation, raise spirits, and hand out food parcels to the most vulnerable in society during the pandemic. Siobhan, it's been way too long since last we spoke. How are you?
Good, yes. Ditto, Andrew. It's nice to be on with you.
Well, thank you for joining us this evening. It's great to see you. Now, we'll go to our first story, and that is that the US, the UK, and Australia are setting up a trilateral security partnership aimed at confronting China, which will include helping Australia to build nuclear-powered submarines. The initiative, called AUKUS, was announced jointly by US President Joe Biden and Prime Ministers Boris Johnson and Scott Morrison joined virtually by video conference. They presented it as the next critical step in an old alliance. Morrison said that teams from the three countries would draw up a joint plan over the coming 18 months for assembling the new Australian nuclear-powered submarine fleet, which will be built in Adelaide, not Barrow-in-Furness in Cumbria, where the UK boats are built. The project will make Australia only the 7th country in the world to have submarines propelled by nuclear reactors. None of the three leaders mentioned China, but there was no doubt that the initiative was a response to China's expansionist drive in the South China Sea and increasing belligerence towards Taiwan. The agreement spells the end for a $90 billion contract Australia had signed with the French company Naval Group in 2016. France's foreign minister criticised the new partnership, accusing Australia of going against the letter and the spirit of their deal. China has told the US, the UK and Australia to abandon their Cold War mentality or risk harming their own interests. A Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman, Zhao Lijian, said the US and UK's decision to export highly sensitive nuclear-powered submarine technology to Australia was a case of extremely irresponsible double standards. So Siobhan, first of all, what do you think this announcement will mean for the current political tensions between China and the West?
Well, it's not exactly going to calm it, is it? I mean, there was something I thought kind of quite disturbing about the sight of three men introducing nuclear into the Pacific. Which is, the countries, New Zealand's kind of a bit nervous about that. The treaty at Rarotonga, signed back in the 1980s, was looking specifically for a nuclear-free Pacific. So there's a kind of change there now, as subtle as it might seem initially. There's something I thought deeply kind of can I say the term macho pissing contest? I mean, that kind of what it looked to me. It looked like just this kind of macho show of force, which I find is deeply disturbing. It's not going to help relations with China, of course it's not. It's actually not going to help relations with Australia with other countries like New Zealand. That kind of New Zealand foreign minister said yesterday or today that it just shows the different directions that they're coming in. The Pacific is supposed to be a nuclear free terrain. It's the beginning of a massive change, I think, which is, I think, personally disturbing as an anti-nuclear campaigner. I also think that there is an element here of we're moving into arena when we should be moving away from nuclear. We've just signed a deal that brings nuclear into a kind of a non-nuclear area, and I think that is disturbing. I don't care whether it's the weapons that's nuclear or whether the submarine is driven by nuclear, and I know that Biden was very clear to distinguish the difference between the two. But nuclear is nuclear, and the consequences of nuclear are centuries long if there's an error and a mistake, as we know by Fukushima and Chernobyl. Dangerous times, I think. I don't think it's a good move. I know that they're seeing this as a defensive move and that China's been on the offensive, but you don't fight fire with fire, as the old cliche goes. We don't put a nuclear presence in to show power anymore. These days are gone, or they should be gone. This is not in the spirit of a kind of new forward-thinking global politics. I want to take, the kind of New Zealand aspect here is like, this is not the right direction. We do not solve these issues by a show of nuclear power. Not a good kind of move in a kind of very tense global situation, I think.
Thanks, Siobhan. We'll unpack what you've been saying there a little bit. There are a couple of things that you were saying that certainly resonate with me. On Scotland at 7, there seems to have been a lot of military news just recently, military manoeuvres in Russia, missile tests in the Korean Peninsula, and I even saw the notorious old warmonger, the former US diplomat and national security advisor John Bolton, had been disinterred and was back on the news today. Is this just that the hawks around the world are looking for a new playground now that Afghanistan has been closed down and they seem to have become a bit bored with Yemen, so they want another conflict?
It's certainly. There's been a rise in tension that's kind of seems to have aligned with a rise in the global right as well. And I think that, as we move into kind of trade wars often end up in real, often evolve into real wars. And I think that the escalation of those are kind of is quite disturbing. I think from a UK perspective, and this is where I was thinking this morning, which fits in with what you were saying, Andrew, I will get to your point, I promise, that what we've got is, it's kind of a post-Brexit deal that's built on defence and nuclear, and economies built on war are never particularly kind of good economies. Global economies are run through war. I mean, war is a massive economic driver, as horrific as that may sound, but it's the sad fact. I think as we move into kind of a global meltdown as well, because of the COVID situation and the kind of the extreme difficult financial areas that we're moving into, war becomes an easy way of making money, and that sounds a horrendous thing to say, but it is kind of what's happened over the last kind of decades, that war becomes the economic driver because there's a lot of money to be made from war.
That's a fair point, Siobhan. You at least seem to have learned the lessons from history, even if some others haven't. You were talking also about the other difficulties, international difficulties that this announcement may bring. In particular, New Zealand having banned nuclear-powered vessels from its waters. Now, I suspect that the Australian Navy will be unable to resist the temptation to test that ban and to show off, and to not show off their newly acquired technology. Now, that strikes me as a scope for more local tension. And of course, the New Zealanders have a history of being at the wrong end of foreign security organisations and their vessels causing trouble in New Zealand waters. So, how do you see it playing out between New Zealand and Australia, given the divergence in approach that you pointed out, and which seems to be the case now?
It's quite a difficult one, isn't it? I mean, New Zealand have been criticised by Australia and the US for what they see as taking a relatively neutral position regarding China. But I mean, New Zealand's position seems to be, look, we don't want to get involved in these kind of back and forth tensions. We kind of, we have different values now. I think that the foreign minister was talking about foreign policy based on value based rather than anything else, rather than national interests and so forth. But I think you're right. I mean, New Zealand is a much smaller country, but they've also got a strong anti-nuclear history. Australia did as well. I mean, they signed the Treaty of a Nuclear-Free Pacific back in the 80s, and up until this point, it was relatively, they were holding on to that, although they refused to kind of sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So there is that kind of element there that I think that, there must be a little bit of nervousness in the kind of the houses of the New Zealand Parliament at this moment in time. I think that it's two very different cultures now, isn't it? I think that Australia's kind of, by Australia throwing its lot in with the UK and with the US in terms of international affairs, it does suggest that there's a kind of a neediness, as you say, to get involved in the global warring, as it were, which New Zealand don't want a part of. It looks like New Zealand might be dragged unwillingly into things that they really don't want to kind of get involved in. So I'm feeling for New Zealand actually, because they've had a strong and proud anti-nuclear history that must, the thought of it's bad enough us seeing nuclear submarines kind of going up for water somewhere, but at least we have an opportunity to get rid of them. But for New Zealand, I think that's going to be a tricky one, and I don't think it's going to help relations for sure.
It's an interesting point that you make. At the press conference, the three middle-aged white men on the podiums were at pains to suggest that the naval and associated artificial intelligence technology that's included in this deal will be kept separate from the existing Five Eyes electronic spying network, of which the US, Australia, and the UK are part. Now, to your point you were just making, the other two members of Five Eyes are Canada and New Zealand. So is this now going to destabilize? Do you think there's a risk that this might destabilize? And I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, but the Five Eyes agreement that's in place, which includes Australia and New Zealand, and now that three of those five members are now saying they're taking, or they've bought another ball and are going to play in a particular playground in a different way. So there's two things there. How do you think it's going to affect the Five Eyes spying network, which all of the members seem to think is a great idea? And do you believe the assertion that the technology that's being spoken about in this deal will in fact be kept separate from the Five Eyes network?
We all start off with kind of, we've all seen it 100 times before, whether that's in our personal life or in international government, but we're always promised that these things will never happen, and then 10 years down the line you go, it's totally going to happen. So I think these things will naturally merge just as evolution, despite you can say that Biden has good intentions, you can say that it was a deliberate move to kind of bring them together, but either way I think it's inevitable they will kind of eventually merge together. Why wouldn't they? It just seems kind of, technologically inevitable almost. In terms of the Five Eyes, I mean, there's a break in the social contract there, I think, a wee bit, isn't it, between the five nations, and it's noted that Canada and New Zealand, who have very different political structures within their, or very different political governments now. And I thought kind of Biden was kind of more, moving towards that kind of element of social democracy than the other way. But I think that there is a kind of tension there now. There must be, because you've got three countries, like you say, harking out on their own. The social contract that bonded those five has kind of been broken a little bit. So I'd love to be a fly on the wall in the discussions between Canada and New Zealand and the rest of the countries, for sure.
Absolutely. And I should say thank you. You were talking about values-based foreign policy. And you were clearly channeling the late Robin Cook there, and you were making me feel very old. But thank you for that
Oh, I
anyway.
wasn't actually. It was the New Zealand foreign minister that spoke about that. I didn't connect with Robin Cook actually.
Bless him.
But well
Bless him.
done.
Not to worry. Not to worry. I got a sudden flashback there. We'll move on to our next story now, and that's that cutting universal credit by £20 a week is an unconscionable move that breaches international human rights law and is likely to trigger an explosion in poverty, the United Nations Poverty Envoy has said. In an excoriating intervention alongside a letter to the UK government, Olivier de Schutter, the UN-appointed rapporteur on extreme poverty, said that the withdrawal of the £1,000 a year uplift from next month was deliberately retrogressive and incompatible with Britain's obligations to protect its citizens' rights to an adequate standard of living. It's unconscionable at this point in time to remove this benefit, he said, adding the decision to cut universal credit, which was boosted last year to help people get through the pandemic, was based on a very ill-informed understanding of its impact on claimants. For these people, £20 a week makes a huge difference and could be the difference between falling into extreme poverty or remaining just above the poverty line. If the question is one of fiscal consolidation to maintain the public deficit within acceptable levels, then you should raise revenues, not cut down on welfare at the expense of people in poverty. De Schutter urged the government to drop its plans to withdraw the £20 uplift from the 6th of October, saying it was too soon. There was plentiful evidence showing millions of people would struggle to afford food and pay essential bills as a result. In the House of Commons today, SNP MP Chris Stevens warned that the universal credit cut could make millions destitute overnight, given many were unaware of it until recently and have been unable to plan for a £1,040 slash in their income. So, first of all, Siobhan, I'm aware that the lawyer Olivier de Schutter succeeded Philip Alston, and he in 2018 produced a scathing report on the impact of austerity in the UK, calling rising child poverty levels not just a disgrace, but a social calamity and an economic disaster. So do you think we're just seeing more of the same from Westminster, and that they will ignore the UN reporter on extreme poverty completely?
Well, they ignored the last one, didn't they? So why wouldn't they ignore this one? I think that, there comes a point in time where, if someone continues to do something despite being told again and again and again that this will harm children, and it will, this will harm children, this will harm a certain group of people, there is only a point where you can reach where you say that's stupidity and ignorance. I think that de Schutter was being actually quite generous by saying that they didn't understand the effects that they would have. I think that Westminster know exactly what the effects of this will be. I think the key issue we have here is that they don't actually care. And I think that we've seen that for quite a long period now. We saw that in the austerity agenda. We see it now. This is austerity 2.0. You've had two United Nations envoys, as you've just said, telling the UK government very, very clearly that this is going to be absolutely disastrous. De Schutter said in his speech as well that this was breaking international human rights law, and it can't be done. I think the UK is signed up to the International Covenant of Social, Economic and Cultural Rights. Under that, they have to do a risk assessment, an impact assessment, in order to assess what taking away that money would be. Of course, that's not being done because it's never got done. This is just a knee-jerk reaction. It's exactly this. I think I was saying that the other week here as well. It's this kind of action that actually completely alienates Westminster, not just from Scotland and Wales and even Northern Ireland, but from the rest of the world. If the UN are screaming out saying, don't do this, this is disaster, this will have a massively negative impact on poor families and children, because children are going to be massively affected from this as well. Don't do it. At what point do we have to accept that it's done through malice? I think it's time that we begin to see through the veil of Westminster actions and stop giving them the benefit of the doubt as a cultural institution, as a political institution. this is not an ignorant move. This is a deliberate move, and I think that's what makes it phenomenally cruel as well.
Absolutely, Siobhan. Now, you're right. Last week the government said it had not carried out a formal impact assessment of the cut, as it constituted a return to, quote, business as usual, unquote. Why do you think there
Yeah.
would not be a formal impact assessment of this cut?
Because they know exactly what the formal impact would say. They know exactly what the formal impact assessment would say. That's the reason that they're not doing it, because we know from the evidence that we're already told, given how many people will be affected by that cut and what the effects of those cuts will be. Every single charity is screaming out saying this is going to have a massive detrimental impact. You don't take money away from your poorest sections of society. It doesn't matter whether you raised it 6 months before or not. You simply do not do that. The impact assessment would have shown that very, very clearly what the impact would be. I think it was the Citizens Advice Bureau that did a survey a few weeks ago, and I can't remember the figures, but it was a huge amount of people saying that they would struggle to buy food. They would struggle to pay the bills. This makes things so much harder. That's the reason why there's not an impact assessment, because they know what it's going to say.
Absolutely, Siobhan. Now, you use the word malice there, and with that in mind, perhaps, do you think, and I'm quoting De Schutter again, do you think that you do improve the productivity of workers or improve the rate of people in employment by pushing people into poverty?
It's such an ancient, discredited concept of economics now, and I cannot believe that we're still having discussions like this in a society like this. Of course, it's not. You do not get productivity if you flog people like a dead horse. It's simply not the case. If people are too poverty-stricken, they're too hungry, they're too depressed, they're too despondent about life in general in order to be productive. We only have to look at kind of the recent Iceland report on the 4-day working week, and it tells you what a kind of good economic structure and a good well-being based economy will give us. Basically, the report was very, very clear. Less working hours will not only not reduce productivity in many areas across the board, it increased productivity. The countries with less working hours, for instance, have better productivity. And that was the point. They were very, very clear that they wanted the rest of the world to know from their experiment on reducing to the 4-day working week. It is an absolutely outdated economic structure that you have to work people into the ground in order to get more out of them. It's a ridiculous concept, and it is just a cruel concept, actually, because it has no economic value as well as moral value either. So it's not like you can argue, well, we could do this, we could punish people into kind of long hours, poverty-stricken conditions, and we get a better economy. It's not even the case. The Keynesian economic model in the post-45, they recognise that immediately, that actually what we have is, if we've got a happy, healthier workforce, then we have a better economy. It is such a self-defeating economic model, and it shows you that it's not about even the economy as such. It's about creating a buffer for the mega rich that's at the top. That's unacceptable in this day and age. It's also the reason why Scotland and England are on extremely divergent paths now, because it's not the model Scotland would ever sign up to.
Absolutely, Siobhan. One last question on this story before we move on. Why do you think 6 Conservative former work and pension secretaries have urged the government to abandon these plans? And one of those 6 is the political architect of universal credit, Ian Duncan Smith. My apologies for using his name. Why do you think that these former secretaries are urging the government to abandon its plans, and the government seems determined to plough on in the face of all of this criticism?
Isn't it? Marvel when, ex-Tory ministers that we had in the past thought was cruel are now saying this is too much. I think it shows that, there's a kind of an element of crossing the Rubicon in terms of economic and moral strategy, we have moved into a very, very hard line. We saw that by the government reshuffle, didn't we, a few days ago? The hardliners kind of moved into position much more. And I think that that's what we've got now. It seems it's an incredibly self-defeating strategy by Westminster. I think that these Tory ex-pension ministers are, if nothing else, if it's not from ethics, then perhaps it's probably because they recognise how much they're going to be punished in the polls as a result of this. Remember that they gained a lot of seats from Labour lands who will be deeply affected by these. So, for a self preservation issue, if nothing else, then you'd think that they would do this. It's quite remarkable that they're still insisting on doing it. But we have this constant, jaw dropping. Really, they're doing that? Why? None of it makes any sense beyond this dogged, single kind of ideological idiocy, for want of a better word.
Your word, absolutely, Siobhan. Thank you. We'll move on to our next story this evening, and that is that the UK government plans to hike national insurance will slash the pay rise given to nurses in Scotland by at least 20%. Research by the SNP has shown that Band 5 nurses can expect their national insurance payments to increase by at least £206.70. That's more than 20% of the pay rise they received as part of the 4% increase given to Agenda for Change health and social care staff. Band 5 nurses on the higher rate can expect their pay rise to be eaten into by nearly a quarter due to the national insurance hike planned by the Tory government. SNP MSP Emma Harper, herself a registered nurse, said that Scotland's NHS and social care staff have done a monumental job throughout the pandemic and have been nothing short of heroic, putting their own lives at risk to care for others, and welcomed the fact that the Scottish Government recognised their efforts with the biggest NHS pay rise in Scotland in the history of devolution. Now the Tory plans to hike national insurance will take a significant chunk of that money out of the pockets of hard-working nurses and use it to pay for England's social care problem, demonstrating how regressive their national insurance increase is for those on lower incomes, said Ms Harper. So, Siobhan, under these plans to increase national insurance, an NHS worker who earns £26,104 per year will see their pay rise of 4% slashed by 21%. Now, you were saying a moment ago about the Westminster government crossing the Rubicon. I wonder if, in fact, the Westminster government is determined to stay on the wrong bank of the Rubicon all the way through. And because is this just the Tory government picking on its usual victims again? Nurses, teachers, the low paid?
It feels like that, doesn't it? It's like that there was a temporary shift during COVID where there was teeny moments where you thought, okay, the Tories have perhaps moved towards just a bit more of a kind of welfare-based model of economics, and then bang, it's right back to their usual, as you say, the usual Tory victims. And this is the thing. I always remember growing up, my dad said, the Tories will never learn. They're always going to look after their own. And we are seeing an example here again where it is literally those, Mary Brooks, for those that work the hardest, that I least provided. We have exactly that situation. The national, you couldn't have gotten any more kind of regressive taxation almost than national insurance, and it mires the whole care system now in a kind of complete controversy, and actually takes money away from the poorest, as you said, and not just those that don't work, but the working poor as well. It's literally, this is again exactly what austerity did. This is exactly what they did. They did not raise taxes in terms of taxing the richer people. What they did is they punished the poor for the sins of the rich, and that's exactly what seems to be happening again. If you think about it on a kind of Scottish, kind of UK level as well, and this is becoming more and more obvious that for every move that Westminster does, the Scottish government are kind of running like mad in order to keep the people of Scotland afloat. And that's not a situation that we really should be in. We can't constantly spend money just to stand still. And that's what seems to be happening now as well.
Absolutely. Thanks, Siobhan. We'll move on to our next story now, and that is that the SNP has said that Scotland is getting fleeced by the UK government over missing Brexit compensation. And that's as the European Parliament approves over €1 billion in Brexit subsidies for Ireland, as part of a €5.3 billion package for EU countries hit hardest by Brexit disruption. Stephen Flynn MP said that the Chancellor must cough up the missing billions in Brexit compensation that Scotland is owed, as Boris Johnson's disastrous deal continues to hit Scotland's businesses and economy hard. The SNP business spokesperson said the only way to keep Scotland safe from the long-term damage of Brexit is to become an independent country, with the full powers needed to regain Scotland's place in Europe and boost economic growth. A study by Warwick University in 2019 found that Scotland had already lost more than £3.94 billion from Brexit. Scottish Government analysis shows Brexit could cost Scotland £9 billion, or the equivalent of £1,600 for every person by 2030 when compared to the situation with EU membership. Analysis from the House of Commons Library using IMF data shows the UK is the only country in North West Europe to have suffered from declining exports since the 2016 Brexit referendum. While Ireland has increased its exports by 48.1%, the UK has suffered a downturn of more than 5%. Now, Siobhan, as the rowdy but tiny band of Tories in Scotland, and I'm thinking here especially of all 6 of their MPs, never fail to remind us, 1,018,322 Scots voted to leave the EU in 2016. Do you think that proud band of around 1 million are pleased with this cost, £1,600 per person by 2030? Or do you think they've got an appetite to be even worse off yet?
I mean, it's a hard one, I think, isn't it, for those that voted Brexit? I'm pretty sure there's a lot of regret in that respect as well. But the fact of the matter is, Scotland as a whole did not vote Brexit, and we voted overwhelmingly to remain as part of the EU, and that has never changed since 2016. We consistently, at every single election, vote for the pro-European parties. The reason the Lib Dems, I think, failed at the last election was probably because they dropped their commitment, immediate commitment to returning to Europe, because it probably was the only thing that was keeping the Lib Dems going in a country that was very pro-Brexit. The fact of the matter is, it's not just the economic damage, although that is extraordinarily difficult for a country like Scotland, who's dependent on kind of the export of good food and kind of good branding. It is the fact that we are continuously dragged into this against our will, continuously over and over again. Yes, 1 million and odd people did vote Brexit, of course they did. But as a nation, we voted overwhelmingly against. For every one person that voted Brexit, there was 2 people voting to remain part of the European Union. That's democracy, that's how it works, or that's how it's supposed to work. We didn't even want to vote in the first place. People were all a bit kind of, what's going on here? But yes, these economic consequences are going to be huge. The problem we have now is the timing for independence, to try and get that independence referendum at a time where people in Scotland feel comfortable enough to make a decision. And I think that is a realistic kind of thing we have to consider. But before Brexit does too much damage, or before a Brexiteering government does too much damage, because it's not just Brexit, it's the ideology that drives Brexit that's part of the problem as well. So I know there's a lot of controversy over kind of where to do the referendum, but the timing here is a difficult one, because we do have to go before the damage is deep seated into the kind of economic and social structures.
Thanks, Siobhan. And as it happens, of course. Our next story touches on exports of food and drink from Scotland, because the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs and Islands, Mary Goodgin, has written to Baron David Frost expressing concern at the UK government's decision to alter and to delay further importing stages of the border operating model. In the letter, Ms Goodgin highlights the UK government's lack of consultation with the devolved nations, giving Scottish ministers no involvement in something that has material impact on Scotland and its food and drink industry. Ms Gudgeon said the UK government's approach to the EU exit had resulted in problems across Scotland's economy and in particular for food and drink and rural businesses. She has called for meaningful engagement on the introduction of customs and controls to protect animal, plant or public health from the importation of goods from the EU to the UK, and has warned that Scottish ministers may use devolved powers to protect the interests of Scottish agriculture, food and people. Now, Siobhan, I'm reminded that Baron Frost was a career diplomat, and then after that he was chief executive of the Scotch Whisky Association. Now, at that time, he wrote that leaving the EU was fraught with economic risk. But now that he's been put in the House of Lords by Johnson, he seems to have changed his tune. Do you think he'll listen to Mary Gudgeon?
What do you think? No, of course. I mean, the whole. I mean, and it's part of that, like what I was saying just there, that it's not just Brexit that's the issue; it's the ideology behind it, and what that is a centralisation and an authoritisation of power. What the devolved nations want or need is of no consequence to Westminster, and we see that time and time again, from the vote in 2016 to almost every single step of negotiations since then. It doesn't matter whether it has massive impact on Scotland. Westminster has no care or concern over that. And the letter from Mary was a good letter, but all it did was really highlight how powerless we actually are. I think that there really comes a time where we have to kind of say, come on, enough is enough. If we can't continue down this path where we have absolutely no control or no authority over how our future lives are going to go. We are rendered now almost completely powerless because of Brexit. And you kind of have to wonder sometimes whether that was part of the kind of rationale behind it, was to almost immobilise us. And that's because that's certainly what seems to be happening. And it makes it patently obvious again and again and again, the only way we can do this immobilisation and have some control over our future is to become independent, because there's no compromise. There's no attempts from Westminster to include the devolved governments in order to placate our concerns. I was saying this, I was out leafleting this morning and we got talking to a guy who was a lifelong Indie supporter. And we were talking about just that, was it Boris Johnson said the other day that he wants to rule, for 10 years. And I thought, that is a terrifying prospect for Scots. Scots are looking at that and going, I'll vote anything apart from that. It's it's just gonna, but these are the issues that we've got now. We are completely excluded from that democratic process. There is no other path left open to us now. There's no placating of Scotland and what we need.
Thanks, Siobhan. We'll move on now to our next story, and that is that the South of Scotland SNP MSP Emma Harper has received confirmation from Scotland's Rural Economy Secretary that work on the plan for the creation of a border checkpoint in Stranraer following the UK's departure from the European Union has been paused. The SNP MSP raised the issue with the Scottish Government, who stated that in the absence of any assurances from the UK Government, and given the enduring uncertainty surrounding the UK Government's approach to the Northern Ireland Protocol, that they have had to pause the construction of the border post. The Scottish Government started work last autumn to build the checkpoint, which would have applied devolved sanitary and phytosanitary controls on EU goods arriving into Scotland from Belfast and Larne. The Scottish Government has been engaging with all the stakeholders, the UK Government, Dumfries and Galloway Council and other officials to determine the scope, scale and specification of this work. However, the UK Government has failed to provide any assurances over the funding for this infrastructure and over how Northern Irish goods would access the UK without the need for checks, as agreed in the Northern Ireland Protocol, which guarantees unfettered access. The Scottish Government said that this has led to the decision to pause until they receive greater clarity on the long-term funding, the need for this infrastructure, and more information about the timescales when controls might finally come into effect. Now, Siobhan, the appearance of the words uncertainty and paused and Brexit in the same sentence shouldn't really come as a surprise to anybody now. Food producers, hauliers, the Scottish Government And no doubt whoever had won the contract to build the border control point are now becalmed with this uncertainty. How are
Yeah.
all these bodies, and in due course the likes of you and me, how are they supposed to operate with so little certainty from the Brexiting UK government?
I know it's the day to day kind of operations now that are just kind of crumbling away almost. I remember when Marie Goujon came to give us a talk at my kind of local village, and she talked about this constantly. It's like just when you think you've kind of grasped what's going to happen, this was before the deadline, but just when you think you've grasped what happened, then another thing comes in, and then it's all uncertainty again. And it was just this constant lurch from we think we understand what's going on, and then there's uncertainty. And this kind of border control seems exactly that exact same pace. No one knows what's going on. The UK government are probably silent because they don't know themselves what's going to happen, because they're kind of lumbering from uncertainty to uncertainty, and basically always trying to square the circle that they will never get, but are always continuously going, but we want it because we're Britain. So there's this kind of constant getting in the way of what Scotland needs to do. It's never been, I think, more clear now that they are becoming a weight around Scotland in terms of what we want to do and need to do, to make sure that our kind of the post-COVID recovery is a safe and secure one. It's farcical. 10 years ago, we would have been laughing at this, thinking it was a comedy series.
Absolutely. Thanks, Siobhan. We'll move on from Brexit stories now. And that's because the EU governments have been urged by Brussels to take action to protect journalists after an increase in physical and online attacks on members of the press. Issuing its first ever recommendation on journalist safety, the European Commission has called on EU governments to set up free contact points for media workers who face physical or online threats in order to ensure a rapid response from police and prosecutors. It also wants to make sure journalists who have become victims of crime have assured access to counselling, legal advice and shelter. According to the Commission, 908 journalists and media workers were attacked in 23 EU member states in 2020, resulting in physical and mental injuries, as well as damage to property. This intervention follows a series of high-profile murders that have shocked Europe, including the killings of Malta's Daphne Caruana Galizia and Slovakia's Jan Kuciak, who both investigated corruption in their home countries. Of course, this year, the Dutch crime reporter Pieter de Vries was murdered on a busy Amsterdam street, and the Greek investigative reporter Georgios Karavash was gunned down on his way home from work. Reporters Without Borders registered the murder of 4 journalists in the 10 years before Karuna Galizia's murder in 2017, and EU officials have said that they are alarmed about the increasing number of attacks. The EU Commission's Vice President, Vera Jourova, said that talking to the families of Karuna Galizia and Kuciak had been one of the most difficult moments of her previous role as the EU Commissioner for Justice. So, Siobhan, why do you think journalists and reporters are being attacked in what are reported to be increasing numbers?
I think that we should probably look at this as a kind of wider process, and what we've had over the last few years is increasing concern over the reductions of press freedom across the board and across Europe. Freedom House reported in 2019 that almost 1 in 5 countries had reduced their kind of press freedom over the previous 5 years, and one of the concerns that has been raised over the last few years is that this will lead to an increase in violence. It's also an increase in kind of right-wing populism, but also occurring within kind of the more democratic structures as well. There is a kind of state restriction, or an increasingly state restriction of press freedom across Europe now, and part of that process is actually a vilification of journalists. You just need to look at, I think I mentioned Donald Trump a lot, but he's a very, very good example of how that works. He stood and he vilified journalists across the board, threatening to their freedom. They made up lies, fake news, all that kind of stuff. The UN spoke about this a few years ago, that allegation of fake news across Europe was particularly powerful in trying to suppress press rights across the board as well. And of course, once you start vilifying a section of the public, as we know from our history, it generally does lead to more violence. It's not a coincidence that the journalists that you mentioned here were anti-corruption journalists, because there you have it's the kind of the nature of the journalism is to ensure accountability from government and state and the country that they live in as well. So the two, they're not disconnected, and I think we have to begin to see that connection. Is that the rise in violence is part of a wider process of state suppression across Europe, and it is a worrying. It's a worrying consequence of that.
Absolutely.
And it comes from an increasingly authoritarian process, not just in Europe but in other countries as well.
Absolutely. Thanks, Siobhan. For our next story, we'll come back to Scotland, and that is that a strategy to deliver world-class cancer care for children and young people has been published by the Scottish Government. The Collaborative and Compassionate Cancer Care, the Cancer Strategy for Children and Young People in Scotland 2021 to 2026, was launched today by Health Secretary Humza Yousaf during an online event. The strategy highlights 10 priorities for the next 5 years, supported by almost £6 million of investment, and they include, working towards funding genetic testing to provide personally targeted treatment, expanding chimeric antigen receptor T-cell therapy, CAR-T, to teenagers and young adults, setting up a national molecular radiotherapy service for children, funding a dedicated health workforce to care for teenagers and young adults, raising the profile of supported care services and holistic care, and developing a single centre of excellence to provide radiotherapy treatment to improve survival amongst children with cancer. Now, Siobhan, a few words leapt out at me from this strategy, principally the word compassionate in the title, but also then in terms of the highlights, a dedicated health workforce to care for teenagers, raising the profile of supported care services and holistic care in particular. So do you think that this strategy is new? That this new strategy is capable of being delivered in a sufficiently compassionate way in a health service that's under such pressure?
Yeah, I mean I think that's the tension, isn't it? And we have had an increase in child cancers over the last 10 years as well. I think that I think in a lot of cases the Scottish government has the ideology, I think, and the social democratic and the care and compassion behind it, but the kind of they can't often deliver as well as we would all hope because of kind of finances and restrictions, etc., etc. That's not necessarily always a Scotland versus Westminster thing. It's just that sometimes the reality is that makes it more difficult. If we can maybe deliver half of what we're hoping, then we are in a good thing. I think that the drive behind this is a good one. It's just whether we can do it to an extent that the kids deserve. I like the idea of a kind of a teenager specific structure, because I think that teenagers are quite unique in terms of how they deal with illness as well. It's not quite adult. It's a hard situation to be in. I think being a kid with cancer, incredibly isolating as well. I hope so. I mean, I've got high hopes about it, but we are in difficult straits, the NHS, and despite the money that the Scottish Government has promised, we are in a difficult situation. I mean, we've got the situation where the Army has to come in and help with the paramedic situation now as well. So we're not in a massively healthy place.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thanks, Siobhan. And we'll move on to another Scottish story, and that's that low-income families will benefit from a £320 uplift before Christmas as part of the Scottish Government's commitment to tackling child poverty. Eligible families with children in school will receive payments of £160 per child in October and December. 2 bridging payments of £100 each have already been made via local councils, taking the total to £520 this year. The cash equivalent to the Scottish Child Payment, a £10 a week benefit which provides regular additional financial support for families already in receipt of qualifying benefits to assist with the cost of caring for a child under the age of 6. The Scottish Child Payment will be extended to all eligible under-16s by the end of 2022, with quarterly bridging payments made in the interim. The Scottish Government also intends to double the Scottish Child Payment to £20 per week as quickly as possible following the expansion. Social Justice Secretary Shona Robeson highlighted the payments today as she opened a debate in the Scottish Parliament on creating a fairer society. She said, "We are determined to build a better future for Scotland's children, and we know how important these payments will be to families in need this winter, particularly with rising fuel bills and Christmas just around the corner." So, Siobhan, do you think that this shows that the Scottish Government has a rather more compassionate, there's that word again, compassionate approach than Westminster?
I think absolutely hands down. I think that it's this kind of thing that we absolutely need more of. I think the problem we have, and this comes back to the universal credit cuts, is that a lot of these families who have kids and are on universal credits, they'll get it in one hand and it'll be taken out from the other. So we really do have a problem. Again, we're kind of forking out money in order to stand still. But yes, it is. That's a massive difference. That can make a huge difference in terms of kind of family life and just making things that little bit more easy. Yes, of course it is. It's about giving children that chance. And Shona Robeson is absolutely right. She's not Social Justice Minister for nothing. It is about creating a structure where kids do not have to grow up in poverty anymore. We could do so much more. But we are, yet again, we're handing out money to stand still, and that is not good enough. We can't continue to do this because we end up exhausted but getting absolutely nowhere. And our families and our kids get nowhere as a result as well. Thank God we have it, because if you were a kid in England, you wouldn't have that, and that's going to be much more disastrous. So we are kind of staving off the worst effects. But again, it's Westminster imposed effects that we're trying to stave off here. That's simply not good enough.
Now, that's a very good point that you make, Siobhan. I'm absolutely certain that every single pound will be valued and will be very gratefully received by the families who need it the most. And I'm sure it'll make a real difference. But to use your word, are cash handouts the answer to levels of inequality and poverty, which decades of Tory brutal deindustrialisation and then dogmatic austerity have caused in our communities?
It's one of those temporary solutions, isn't it? And I think that it is that kind of it's almost kind of it's kind of paper, and it's trying to fill some of the gaps, I think, at this moment in time. But I think that in a longer term and in terms of a post-COVID recovery, we can't do it in a patchwork basis. We need a much more sustained approach to that. The concept of the wellbeing economy, and it's not a kind of coincidence that Shona's back in the cabinet and dealing with things like the social justice and housing and so forth. These kind of structures in terms of building a kind of a living wage, in terms of building a kind of a more secure structure again, into a safety net. This is, and I think that this is the kind of, we're kind of coming full circle again in terms of the post-45. The concept of the safety net has to kind of come back again to make sure that people do not drop below a certain level. So that concept of the kind of the living wage and the kind of the idea behind the 4-day working week and the kind of compassionate benefit system that raises people when they're in a time of need rather than punishes them for being in need. These are the kind of structures that we need to begin to kind of build much more. And it has to be sustained. We shouldn't have a society when people are reliant on handouts. You're absolutely right. We shouldn't have that. Unfortunately, it's one of those kind of pothole fills at the moment. But we don't want a society like that. And I think if we look at things like the Citizens' Assembly, they were very clear that they didn't want that either. We want something much more sustainable. We shouldn't have people going cap in hand just to live. It's not the sign of a civilised society. Again, however, I do think it is that marked economic and social difference between Scotland now and the way the English system is moving. I think Scotland has retained the social democratic model and the post 45 model, but it's the SNP have managed to modernise that now, and I think that will push us forward. If we do not get this, our generations to come will be affected by this. There is absolutely no doubt of that. We know the impact of poverty. We have to start now, and we have to start long-term thinking in terms of anti-poverty measures too.
Absolutely. Thanks, Siobhan. And we'll come to our final story now, and that is that the collaborative projects for COP26, the wellbeing economy, and the key strategic and trade importance of the Nordic and Baltic nations are to be at the centre of an increased Scottish Government international engagement. Following the pledge in the programme for government to increase links with the Nordic countries, External Affairs Secretary Angus Robertson is meeting representatives of all the Nordic and Baltic nations at Scotland House, the Scottish Government's permanent presence in London, today. Matters of joint concern will include the Wellbeing Economy Partnership between Scotland, Iceland and Finland, and the CivTech Alliance with members from Estonia, Lithuania and Denmark, which is looking at better ways to deliver public services and to encourage digital collaboration. COP26 will feature prominently throughout collaborative projects which address energy efficiency, peatland restoration, carbon capture technology, sustainable living and forest management. These nations are among Scotland's closest neighbours and important trade partners in Europe, and discussions will address many common concerns and challenges, including trade, investment and rural sustainability. As part of the measures to strengthen international links, the Scottish Government also plans to open a new office in Copenhagen earlier next year. Now, Siobhan, indulge me for a second. I'll be a little bit more reflective for a moment. I wonder if this is an indication that current politics in England and Scotland are engaging in similar ploys. Now, what I mean is that the right in England have all but declared war on France several times in the past few years, so it seems that they want to conduct their international politics from the 18th century. Now, I wonder whether the Scottish Government wants to go back even further. I remember that in the 15th century, the timber trade in Norway was known as Skottahandelen. The timber trade was known as the Scottish trade because trade links were so close between Norway and Scotland in the 15th century. So do you think we should be conducting international relations through the prism of a history book nowadays?
Well, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because it's pre-union, and I think that here we are, and this is the answer to the question: what are the SNP doing for independence? Well, this is what they're doing for independence. They are building an alliance, an international alliance with like-minded social democratic countries that put well-being first. And this is where they are very different from the way the UK model is going. This is an attempt to build those structures, social democratic structures, on an international level. The fact that the Wellbeing Alliance was at the centre of that, I think, tells us that very, very clearly. So it's not just about building it on a national level, it's about building it on an international level with connections with like-minded countries. If you look at it on an international level, and I'll get back to your 15th century point, I promise. If you look at it on an international level, you've got countries that are moving towards the right, but you've also got a group of actually smaller population countries like New Zealand and Iceland and Norway and Finland and so forth, who are moving towards a more more liberal, more social democratic, more well-being based economy. Some of them have been doing it for decades, and it's quite not new for them. But you have those alliances now beginning to be built, and the Wellbeing Alliance is a very, very good example of that. So what Scotland is doing is reaching out. To move back to your 15th century, well, we're almost repeating what we're doing in a way because we're thinking about being independent, and we're thinking independently. These alliances were pre-union.
That's a good point.
And these alliances are very much going to be post-union. And I think that that's what it is. This is a build-up of alliances and trade alliances and ideological alliances for when Scotland becomes independent. That is what the SNP are doing for independence. They are literally projecting us onto an international stage and forging good friendships with other like-minded countries.
Brilliant. Thank you, Siobhan. I was also going to ask you about possibly Scotland's most famous Norwegian. That's Brigadier Sir Nils Olaf III, the king penguin who lives at Edinburgh Zoo. But we are right out of time, so the Brigadier can wait till the next time we speak. And those are the stories behind the news in Scotland at 7 this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. If you would like to support us, then please consider subscribing or donating to Broadcasting Scotland. You will find the link to do that on the screen now. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. Meantime, we will be here again tomorrow at 7 o'clock with the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please tune in and join us. I'd like to say very many thanks to Siobhan for joining us this evening and for sharing her thoughts and wisdom and experience with us.
Yay.